Bitcoin research. I brought in Art Laffer, who is a very well-known economist, known for fiscal policy theory as well as monetary policy theory. And he agreed to collaborate. And when he said, "This is what I've been looking for. Ever since we went off the gold exchange standard in 1971, a rules-based global monetary system." And I said, "Oh, wow, how big could this be?" And it was only a $6 billion, we called it network value at the time, market cap. He said, "Well, how big is the US monetary base?" And I said, "Well, it's 4.5 trillion. And now, of course, it's 8 trillion, 7.5, 8 trillion. He said, "Well, there you go." And so I bought personally, and
that's a big number, Art.
And in fact, Chris Berniske was our analyst at the time, and there was no vehicle to put it in our funds. GBTC was just coming of age, and we were doing our due diligence. And so I bought $100,000 worth, just personally, and Chris became, like, here I am, the portfolio manager, and it was his research that moved me to do this, and like it was so early, and so he doubled down on his research. And it was
it's bad if your boss loses money because of your research, right?
But then of course, the rest is history. I guess we're at, is it 300 billion-ish
something like that, yeah.
now, and many people know that we think that's 300 billion in market cap or network value at $24,000. And we have in big ideas, again, our forecast for 2027, I think, is around 650,000, and beyond that, 1.5 million.
Say that again. In the big ideas research that you guys published, what are the two numbers?
The two numbers we have, our base case is roughly 650,000 for 2027. Now that has come down. We were using 1 million plus 4 or 5 years out, but because we've had the debacles associated with centralized, opaque institutions, as opposed to decentralized and transparent, institutions are going to hold back a little bit. But we still think that the million plus is right in our bull case. And you can see how we build our case and look at the assumptions, how much institutional involvement and so forth. Very conservative assumptions. And our conviction actually has grown through this year, grown through this past year, because FTX, Celsius, 3AC, Voyager, all of these were centralized, opaque institutions. They went bust. And even the centralized, regulated institutions, now we're looking at Genesis, probably bankruptcy, yes, Silvergate, these are regulated. And they're but again, they're much more centralized and opaque.
This is interesting. As many people know, I've gone around the world. I've talked to all kinds of different people. And I would say the number one topic, other than like, what is it, that people want to speak about when they come from the traditional world is it's unregulated, right? And there's something about regulation. And these individuals usually come from a perspective of like, oh, the government will regulate it out of existence. The government will ban or outlaw ownership. The government won't allow this to occur. But your point, I think, is Bitcoin as an asset, it's a inanimate object, right? No different than, like, let's say the US dollar. And we don't regulate the dollar, we regulate the companies and individuals who traffic in dollars, right, or use dollars. But there's all these companies in and around Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies that have been regulated. And we see, maybe in a really optimistic lens, stress on them, all the way to failure of these businesses. Can regulation actually stop some of this? Or is regulation, in many cases, it can solve some of the things on the periphery, but we should expect regulated businesses to be just as much at risk as some of the unregulated businesses, and we can't really rely on that regulation as like this crutch, because it seems like most people would say, if it's a regulated business, then we shouldn't be seeing some of the things that we're seeing.
Right. Well, Bitcoin came out of 08, 09, right? And look at all the regulated companies that went under then, and all of the counterparty risk that nobody understood, you know, and all of the paperwork that had not been done. So, you know, I do think about what you're saying. I don't think, we worry about the innovation that is leaving the US and moving to other countries who are much more friendly. The UK, I think is, and Europe generally, from a regulatory point of view, has much more of a solution, more clarity than the US. But I think the American DNA is such, and we see it in how regulators are going this far, but, you know, and the most interesting one to me, now consider the source, we own it. I want to be very clear.
Everything that we've spoken about today, you should assume one of the two of us own it.
Right. So Coinbase. Now, I'm listening to the regulators, and they're saying, well, if it looks like a security and it walks like a security and it quacks like a security, then it's a security. And we will enforce the securities laws. That's what the SEC does. And I'm thinking, well, Coinbase had to go through the SEC. They had to issue an S1, highly regulated. They had a lot of tokens that now the SEC is questioning as securities. Well, has the definition of a security changed since Coinbase went public in 2001? And it went public around the time that Gary Gensler came in. So maybe that's where the disconnect is. Gary Gensler is much more of an enforcer. I don't know, but the definition of a security should not have changed. And if they didn't think these should have been on Coinbase's platform, then they shouldn't have let them go through.
So this is fascinating because in politics, as some of the guests later today will talk about, this idea of changing your mind is almost demonized or condemned, and you hear terms like flip-flopper and all of that. In investing, it's actually embraced by the best investors. And so if you can change your mind when you receive new information, it's seen as a sign of intelligence. Regulators kind of sit in between those two groups. It's a little bit of politics and government, it's a little bit of investment and markets. How should we look at them and their ability to change their mind? Like, is that something that we should look at as like, that's a good thing that they're doing? Or does it make it so hard to invest in a market if a regulator later can change their mind, right? And I'm almost using this as the example of, they just came out and said, hey, we got it wrong before, now we believe this. Is that a good or a bad thing?
Scientists